Hello and welcome back to Tracking Trends. Last week, the government announced changes to what is called a Press Note 3. Press Note 3 essentially is a set of regulations that the government brought in the aftermath of COVID-19 pandemic to restrict Chinese investment because there was a fear that taking advantage of the situation, some of the Chinese companies might try to take over Indian companies. And that could pose certain kind of threat, security threat in time to come. 6 years down the line, the government has decided to ease some of those curbs. And this is a very major development. It has got significant consequences, not just for India China relations, but also what happens here on to India's engagement with economies across the world. I have today two guests to discuss the details of this development and what does it mean. Before I go over to them, however, my request, as always, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so right away. Here are my guests for the day. Dr. Deep Pal, he is the Director of Geopolitics and Public Policy at Koan Advisory Group. It's a New Delhi-based consulting firm. With him is Vedika Pandey, who also works at Koan Advisory, and she specializes more on the legal side of such things. So let's get going. Deep and Vedika, thank you for taking time out. Tell our audience, what are these changes all about? What sense do we make of them? Deep, why don't you take it?
Okay, I'll start us off. Sometime last week, there was a cabinet meeting in which there were some changes that were decided upon. As you mentioned in your introduction, there is something called the Press Note 3, which came out in 2020 April, which basically guides investments into India from India's land border countries, which obviously mean quite a few countries, but it is most impactful on Chinese investments. And of the various provisions that are there in Press Note 3 of 2020, some of these were amended as a result of this cabinet meeting, and that was announced. The two major changes that we can talk about. One is about something called the de minimis rule. It essentially says that if a fund is looking to invest in India and there is Chinese ownership or Chinese money in that fund, so long as the investment in India does not cross more than 10% of Chinese beneficial ownership, right? There is no need to take separate permission for that. However, there is an additional clause which says after the investment is done or after the decision is made, it has to be informed to the DPIIT in the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. That's change number one. Change number two, yeah.
Just to make it clear, so long as the Chinese ownership is not more than 10% of the entity in which the money is invested, right?
Chinese beneficial ownership. So let's say Fund A wants to invest 100 rupees. Okay. Now, obviously, if it's a fund, there's money that has come in from various places, and you can track back that money, right? And as you track it back, these are all the beneficial owners, right? So as long as not more than 10%, so not more than 10 rupees of that 100 rupees that is being invested, okay, is Chinese money, it is fine. Okay, so that's basically what this provision says.
So let's say there is a fund in which Goldman Sachs has put in money, Merrill Lynch has put in money, Alibaba has put in money. So Alibaba's share, if that fund is $100, cannot be more than 10%, right?
That is correct.
Oh, let's go ahead.
Yes. Okay. However, and this was clarified by DPIIT after this announcement was made, this does not apply. This change in rule does not apply to Chinese funds. Okay, so this fund that we're talking about can be Singapore based, can be US based, can be some European country, Australia, wherever else in the world, Dubai, etc. But it can't be a Chinese fund.
Okay.
Okay, so that's provision one. Provision two essentially says that so press note 3 said that if there were Chinese investments that were to be made, there is a permission that has to be taken from the government, right? Now, as part of provision 3, two things were mentioned. One, a set of priority sectors were identified, which are important to India for its national objectives, building India's manufacturing sector up. These private sectors included capital goods, electronic capital goods, electronic components, polysilicon, ingot wafer, right? For these particular priority sectors, this aspect of taking permission stays, but the government is now saying that we will come back to you. We will decide on this, whether it's a yes or a no. We will decide on that and come back to you within 60 days. Now, this is significant because at the time of this announcement, there were reports that said about 600 applications under Press Note 3, where Chinese companies are looking to invest. Around 600 applications are pending approval or disapproval, right? Decisions have not been made in about 600 of them. Now, the government is saying that for these particular priority sectors, and we are still waiting official notification of this this uh, this amendment, which when comes, we will have further clarity on what they mean by these priority sectors, how deep they want to go into, and what kind of components, what kind of input goods are they talking about. We hope to have further clarity on this, but essentially they are saying that for these all the applications that come in, we will decide on that and let you know within 60 days, which for now has been over months. People have applied and waited for months and not heard back. That will be reduced to 60 days. So that those are the two provisions.
Okay, now let me move over to Vedika and ask the question. We have heard about the announcement. Now the notifications have started coming out. Uh, is this good enough, or the devil could be lying in the details? Is this really going to be changing the scene in terms of easing the curbs on Chinese investment? Are we going to see an easy flow of Chinese investment, or are there other things that would matter?
As of now, since only the press note 2 of 2026, which has affected the de minimis rule, like Deep said, is actually a clarification solely. So to answer your question, I think it's too early to say. If let's divide the answer into two halves, right? Let's talk about the de minimis rule first, and then let's go into the 60-day expedited approval process. As far as the de minimis rule is concerned, just to give you some background, some context, Press Note 3, when it came out in 2020, had some ambiguous language in it. Now, what did the Press Note say? It said that any investment, any foreign investment that comes from a land bordering country or from a foreign investor with beneficial ownership from a land bordering country, meaning that the beneficial owner is either situated in a land bordering country like China or a citizen of that land bordering country, required a government approval regardless of the post-acquisition stake of the Chinese entity or the entity with the beneficial ownership of a Chinese entity. However, what ended up happening was that when foreign investors like private equity funds or venture capitalists used to come to India and try and invest in a startup, let's say, this language of what constitutes a beneficial owner from a land bordering country was unclear. Does it mean that even if I have one indirect share in my parent company's parent company's parent company, is that still considered to be beneficial ownership lying with a Chinese entity? And what had actually ended up happening was that authorized dealer banks, which are essentially people that have the sanction from the RBI to deal in foreign exchange, had come up with this informal understanding within the industry where they were sort of linking beneficial ownership to the idea under India's anti-money laundering laws. Now, what do the anti-money laundering laws say? Anti-money laundering laws say that if you have indirect ownership in your entity of more than 10%, and there is a math to do it, of more than 10%, that's considered to be significant enough that you are supposed to be controlled by that entity. Now, beneficial ownership was not linked to control before under investment law, foreign investment laws in India. All that the recent press note from last week or yesterday rather has done is that it has clarified that beneficial ownership means 10% of passive ownership or non-controlling ownership that is not strategic in nature. Now it'll be all of this is to just say that now it'll be easier for a private equity fund to come to India and say that I have some passive indirect ownership that lies with a Chinese company. Now I can invest in you, and it's not more than 10%. Now coming to the second half of the amendments, which is the 60-day expedited timeline. Now, the government press release that came out after the cabinet's decision stated that these sectors are currently a provisional list, which is, like Deep said, it's capital goods, electronic capital goods, some upstream components in the semiconductor electronics industry.
These are actually all sectors. By one estimate, these sectors account for almost 60% of India's imports from China.
Yes, so I did the math there. They account for of India's 106 billion expected trade deficit with China, which was for the year 2025-26, about 63.9 billion of our imports fall in the category of the four sectors that have been announced currently. Which
so that's
63.9, yeah, it constitutes 60 point some change percentage
of our trade gap,
and that percentage of our trade gap with China. Now, what this means is that and I hope that the press note comes soon, which effectuates this change as well. If it comes out in the exact manner that the cabinet note said, it would be a huge deal because we would be able to essentially localize that 60% that we're currently importing from China. And that would, and given our manufacturing ambitions, that would be a very big deal. So to summarize, it's a little early to say whether there is any devil in the details. But that said, the 10% thing was merely a clarification that had come to be an industry understanding anyway. Authorized dealer banks had come to understand that 10% beneficial ownership is not considered significant enough to require government approval.
So now, I mean, that all sounds very good. That you're going to prioritize or expedite inflows in sectors that account for 60% of your trade gap. The hope is that the Chinese will come in, they will manufacture here, they will export back to China, they will export elsewhere, and so that's how they will not only help you bridge the trade gap with China, but they will also help you bridge your trade gap with other countries. Is it going to be as good as it sounds, Deep?
So I think that's a great question, and Vedika has basically moved us forward in the direction of trying to understand that, right? I think that is the dream. That definitely is the dream that we will have Chinese companies from various sectors coming, manufacturing here, bringing their technologies, bringing their people, setting up units here. Okay, look, we get to become a larger part of the supply chain, right? We are no longer just assembling things, but we are manufacturing components here. So the integration is far deeper. That is the ideal objective, right? And and there is a very good example of something similar to this that we've seen happen in the last 20 years, which is in automobiles, right? Where we saw gradually global players come in, auto ancillary industries get built around that. Now there are major auto companies which are not Indian that manufacture out of here, and their entire global exports is sent out of here, right? We know that that happens, and that's a great thing. But it is slightly more difficult as far as this particular story is concerned, and there are multiple reasons for it. If I can take them in order, the first thing is, if you look around the world, this is not something that India is the first country to think of doing with Chinese companies and Chinese manufacturing, right? This is something that has happened across the world. Uh, and everywhere, the expectation has been this, in Europe, in the US, and everywhere. However, Chinese companies, many of which are either directly or indirectly state backed, and therefore their technologies and other things, there is that element of state control over it. They have been very good at not parting with the technology in the same way that companies from elsewhere would have done. If you look at the defense sector, for example, right? For the longest time, earlier Soviet and then Russian companies have been coming here. They've been selling us their hardware. Then they have collaborated with various companies. Earlier, only state-owned companies like Hindustan Aeronautics. More recently, other privately owned companies as well. And the idea is that there is technology transfer. Um, China has actually managed to not do that to that same extent that an American company sometimes does. French companies have done in India. Russian companies, as I mentioned, have done in India. They have been very good at not necessarily doing that. Okay, so now, if we assume that this is going to open up the sector and make it so attractive that all Chinese companies will say, forget the rest of the world, let us all go to India, let us pump our money in, let us build huge factories there, let us do everything there, right? Assuming that that is true, assuming that happens, then will they transfer technology, or will over 10, 15 years, will we see the seeping in of technology as they bring their people, train our people here, build factories, we create the entire supply chain and assembly line and everything? There is a likelihood, yes. We certainly hope that happens, and I'm sure that the way these decisions are being planned, there is that expectation that this logic will work, right? But we will have to wait and see that. However, two other points that I want to mention. Obviously, as is clear from the decisions that have been made and the notifications that are coming out, what we have looked at and what Vedika also said, right? What part of our trade deficit is addressed by these priority sectors? These are the sectors that that are important to India from its manufacturing ambition, from its national objectives of becoming a semiconductor powerhouse, right? The question is, if the other side looks at these same, contributing to the same industries as their priority, right?
Yes.
There has to be sufficient interest on the other side to want to participate in these industries. That we will have to wait and see. And the other part is the predictability question, right? And that is not an India China thing, that is a global thing. Any company that is investing in another country will want to know what their risks are, and there is more clarity about risks if there is more information that is being released in terms of what does it take for a country, for a company to be considered eligible to operate in a country, right? On this, Americans, Europeans do very well. They have these set out conditions that say, okay, this is what we are looking for. This is positive. This is not positive. Okay, that allows companies to hedge their risks, figure out how they need to go about things. Japan is coming out with a law recently. It is supposed to be presented in their parliament later this year, which does the same thing. The Americans and the Europeans, not only do they do this, they bring out annual reports which says, okay, these are the number of permissions that were sought, these many were given, these many investigations happened, this is what the mediated settlements were, and so on. India here, unfortunately, we lag. Okay, for again, not a Chinese company thing. Even if there is an American company, European company, anyone that is trying to invest, there is often very little clarity on what they have to do to make the cut, right? So even when we are saying now that instead of weeks and months and unfortunately sometimes maybe years, you don't have to wait for permission, 60 days is all it will take, and they will come back to you whether we approve or we disapprove. We still haven't said what is the basis on which this determination will be made, right? So
Right.
that, I think, is a very, very important factor. And if we want This is definitely a great step in the right direction. But if we want this to succeed, um, it will be incumbent on us to let investing companies or interested companies know how we are making these decisions. Right? That's something that needs to be looked at.
Vedika, we had some cases where things didn't turn out well for the Chinese. We had the case of Haier that dragged on for a very long time. We had the case of Bide. To some extent, we also had the case with MG, which finally became, JSW
A joint
led
venture.
venture.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, what were the issues in those cases that can be addressed now?
So I believe there were informal conditions, like Deep said, that there is an issue where the conditions for approval are sort of shrouded in secrecy, right? As far as I understand, there were informal prerequisites in any Chinese FDI application, which required that the Indian entity, that they first of all form a JV, where the Indian entity has more or controlling stake, essentially 51%. Um, and the second thing was that there be tech transfer. And what actually ended up happening was that even though the Chinese entity would have 49% or less stake in the company, in the JV, through the tech transfer aspect of their contractual arrangements, they were exercising more control over the JV. And also, it didn't sit particularly well with a lot of these massive state-backed Chinese entities that they would have to come to India and operate on a minority joint venture basis. That said, there have been, I mean, arguably some acceleration in JV formations post the October 2025, the sort of rapprochement that has started between India and China following the heads of state meeting in Kazan. We also saw an acceleration in visa approvals for Chinese technicians visiting India to serve the cause of their Indo-Chinese JVs in India, and that sort of includes the MG Motors and JSW joint venture, or the Dixon and Vivo joint venture, and that showed readiness from the Indian side that, hey, because we recognize that there is a gap in our understanding of the tech, and we need Chinese technicians to come and sort of set this up for us. And because of that, there was an uptake in visa approvals as well.
Yeah, I remember this was sometime toward the end of 2023. There was significant lobbying by the Indian industry because they were saying that they had to pay a lot more money to get these technicians from elsewhere. And many of them, because of the cost competitiveness, had relied on Chinese equipment to build up their factories. And so eventually this got into the economic survey of 23-24 and kind of found finally policy manifestation and in easing of curbs on Chinese technicians. I think that was kind of, there was a context to it, and similarly we see a context here now that India is really struggling to keep FDI inflows in the positive territory, and then the Iran war has badly dented us and threatens to cause more harm as we go along. So one of the triggers seems to be how to bridge the import gap with the Chinese, and how also to open up some new sources of FDI inflows. So one hopes that, as Deep said, this works, but this won't work. This won't yield result immediately, right? Deep, we won't expect TikTok to be back here anytime soon, right? It's going to take time.
That is correct. It is it so. Um, um, it is definitely going to take time, uh, and we don't even know if the government's priorities are on bringing, let's say, a service like TikTok back. Right, as I mentioned, the if you look at the decisions that were made last week, it's very clear that we are focusing on bolstering India's manufacturing capabilities. Right?
Mhm.
We have and we are beginning to accept the dependence on Chinese intermediate goods in the supply chain. Right. This is something that has been known for a while. The government, policymakers, other people working on this have looked at various other ways in which, if whether this can be managed or not. Right. You mentioned how machineries had needed technicians, right? Now some of these machineries, you can look at some of these technologies, you can look at, let's say, South Korea or Japan, that will immediately hike your cost by 20-30% at the least, right? Which
Correct.
is, in the long term, it cannot work, right? So there are various ways, and for even many of the advanced economies, we remember, I'm sure you remember this famous conversation that Piyush Goyal, the commerce minister, had with a German minister, where he talked about some German machinery that India wanted to buy, which was being manufactured in China,
The tunnel boring machines, I guess.
the tunnel boring machines, right.
Yeah.
So the company that owns the technology, right, is a German company, but it's not being made in Germany, it's being made in China. And because relations were between India and China were worse at that point in time, China was finding ways to stop those machines from coming to India, right. So there are, it's there are all of these various kind of concerns that have been plaguing the Indian policymakers' minds about this. But I think we are seeing a time where we are coming to understand that there is no easy go around. Okay, um the contribution of China in the global supply chain, of which India is a part of and wants to be a greater part of, is way too big right now for us to completely avoid China. There are countries that are trying to de-risk, right? Not de-link completely, but de-risk. That is a possibly a worthwhile attempt to make, think of and create alternatives. But where we are in our manufacturing journey right now, we will have to depend on China, and we will have to take steps incrementally, like the one that has been taken. Perhaps some of these steps more forcefully to make India an attractive destination. With time, some of this will bear fruit. To what extent, again, we will have to wait for indications to see. But when it comes to things, services like TikToks, apps, right? Um, China will obviously want a market as huge as India to open up to a Chinese company like TikTok. Um, it is fair to say it is definitely not in India's list of priorities, right? And how we have seen what has happened to TikTok in the US, where the ownership has been separated, that provides perhaps definitely a precedence, and who knows, maybe a viable model where India will say, okay, you want TikTok to come back into India. Let's think of ways in which we can safeguard our data, because
Mhm.
that again falls in the strategic sectors that India is careful about. That was one of the reasons India was concerned about in 2020 when the entire Press Note 3
Yeah.
situation evolved, right? So that those things coming back, we may see some time before something like that is considered.
Yeah. So yeah, TikTok will have to wait
Mhm.
for to return.
Mhm.
Um, India's focus is on how to bring in Chinese money in the manufacturing segment, and particularly in areas where it is dependent on Chinese imports. How far it will succeed, we will have to wait and watch. Few key determinants would be, as both Vedika and Deep, both of you have outlined, will be the predictability of, how the perception around predictability of what we are doing. Uh, More transparency will help. There are best practices that are available around the world. Uh, India may do well to look at them and replicate them here. And let's end on that positive note that China's contribution, as both of you very rightly said, to the global supply chain is so big and so crucial that if we want to be also in the play, there is no option but to engage with China. But how do we engage with China in a manner that does not compromise our interests, that serves our long term goals and long term interests? on that note, thank you very much. Thank you for giving time. And we hope to pick on the services thing sometime later again.